Okay, this is the third part of the tutorial on how to analyze the argument. And if we just recap quickly, we've already looked at the first reading, which was to get the big picture stuff like the issue, the point of view and the key contention. We then went on to do the second reading, which was to get the key arguments, the audience, and the tone. And so in this tutorial we're going to move on to the nitty-gritty stuff, which is the third reading. So this is when we're looking for the language. Okay, now again I want to make the point that if you've done the first two readings, you should find that the third reading it becomes a little bit easier, because what we're trying to do here is we're looking for the evidence. Okay, so if we already know what the key arguments are, okay, and we've already read through the media form a couple of times, we've already got a good idea of what it's all about and what the arguments are. It shouldn't be so difficult to find the evidence, and the evidence are the things down here. So let's just jump straight into the third reading of the blog and try and pick out some of these things. Okay, so if we remind ourselves of the first argument, it was that tattoos have become much more common or mainstream. The attitudes to tattoos have changed. So what we're looking for now is the evidence which supports that argument. So the first thing we can note is the title has some irony there, because the power of ink has lost it. They're now a fashion statement. So that's a language choice there. Okay, we can say everyone has tattoos these days. Okay, that is what we could say is an inclusive statement. So that's an audience appeal. Even me. Okay, so if the author says even me, that's establishing some authority and audience connection, which gives her the means to then talk about it. Okay. If we highlight here, I see enough ink on suburban housewives at the mall to outdo any collection in an Australian prison. I'd say that's almost qualifying as an anecdote. It's a short story, it's about her experience, and it sets up the illustration in support of the key argument. Okay, if we pick out some of the key language, well, let's just take this one and say mega. Oops. Let's go to that one. Mega shopping centre, suburban housewives, newsreaders, sitcom stars, upmarket shoppers. There we can perhaps suggest that language, that language appeals to the audience, or appeals to the younger audience. So the language choice there appeals to equals language choice. So in that first part we have established a few of the key points, the evidence which supports the main argument that we've discovered, which is that tattoos have become common or mainstream. Okay, so let's flip over and look at the rest of the blog. Okay, if we consider the first part of this next page of the blog, is also we've already established that this is sort of a signpost and signals a tonal shift. So in terms of the meta language, the evidence of the argument shifting is that tonal shift there from that one standalone sentence. We can look at some of the language choice here. deviant and incarcerated prisoners and slaves, indelible cruelty, the flesh of those who survived the concentration camps, and genocide. Okay, these kind of words, we can say are more politically, but they're sort of unattractive. They're not nice things to think about. So in that sense, you can say that the author has made an appeal to the reader's conscience, especially when you think about genocide and concentration camps. So in that sense, it's supporting the second argument, which is that tattoos used to be for the deviants and the criminals and the rebellious, but not anymore today. And therefore, persuading the audience to think twice about getting a tattoo is supported by this idea of appealing to their conscience. Tattoos used to be associated with this kind of thing in history. And then similarly, establishing that in the visual there is a serious place for tattoos in terms of the status and the heritage in the Maori culture, also supports the argument of conscience. Don't get a trivial tattoo because there's people out there that it's a lot more meaning for them. So those are some of the key parts of evidence which support that second key argument. Over the page, the blog, we could also add there the fact that she says that tattoos have become sexy. So yeah, they become sexy, whereas you contrast that with the place in history and the seriousness in Maori culture. Okay, let's move on to the next part. Okay, in this part of the blog, for the third key argument, which we identified, which was readers should think twice before getting a tattoo just for trivial reasons. The visual here supports that argument. So we can mention there how now no tattoos before you're 30. What I'll tell my children is a sort of warning to position the audience to think twice. The part of the blog down here where it continues to talk about time. In history, again supports the argument that tattoos over time have changed. And then we move into this sort of idea of the deviant mocking the king, and then defiance becoming part of the culture of tattoos, but even that has changed. So there's some things that we can pick out there, but the key one here is the visual, which supports the argument. Okay, let's just look at the last part of the blog. Okay, in this last part of the blog, we can talk about the second argument here, where she talks about defiling her femininity. Again, reminding ourselves the second argument is that tattoos used to be for deviants and criminals and for the rebellious. Here she's saying that it used to be for the rebellious, which is why she had a tattoo. A handful of us angry young things is a good quote to use. The symbols of our gender are fixed on our own bodies. That supports her argument, but tattoos have now become sexy. So the angry young things, here we can perhaps mention there's some empathy that she has for her audience. They're young, they're feeling rebellious, they want to become independent and make their own stamp on society, but the author argues that tattoos is no longer the way to do that. You know, the symbolism, we can mention the symbolism of tattoos has changed, making tattoos more meaningless than they used to be. Okay, now the third argument about thinking twice. Personally, I find this profoundly annoying. Okay, is a appeal to the audience, which is the tattoo has been commodified, upwards message, fashion's proprietary mark, just goes to make a time too much. Look at the symbol of my rebellion, and I see it as an ornament, as ordinary as any other cosmetic quirk. Okay, here we've got some ornament, as ordinary as any other. There's some assonance there, and then if we contrast that with cosmetic quirk is alliteration. Now those two tools of language are used to draw attention, and that's the concluding remark, so attention for that to make the final contention, which is that the tutu has become commodified. So there's some language tool there. And I think, if I'm looking at that, I think that's about all that I'm going to pull out here. So I think there's some language choice there, British one, there's some humour there to contrast it. Okay, so I think that's sort of a fairly good place to stop. On the third reading, I think we've pulled out a fair amount of language that we can use either as quotes or as meta-language evidence to support the arguments that we identified in the second reading. So what we have to do now is go on to the second part, the second key skill, which is to organize all of our analysis into a structure which then becomes our essay. So that is going to be the subject of the next tutorial, which is, how to structure all of these points that we've made on the three readings, which will then enable us to write a good essay. Okay, thanks a lot.